Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out Linode. With private networking, shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And go to dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, read the show notes, and get in touch. And join the discussion at dataengineeringpodcast.com/chat. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Tomer Shiran about Dremio, the open source data as a service platform. So, Tomer, could you start by introducing yourself?
Sure, yeah. My name is Tomer Shiran. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Dremio. Dremio is a 3-year-old company that's enabling lots of companies around the world to kind of deliver data as a service within their organizations, really making it so that it's not an engineering project every time a data consumer, like an analyst, wants to do something with their data.
And do you remember how you first got involved in the area of data management?
Sure, yeah. I was actually one of the first employees and the VP of product at a company called MapR. That was one of the Hadoop companies back in 2009. That's when kind of Hadoop was the cool thing.
And so can you start off by explaining a bit about what the Dremio product is and how both the project and the business got started?
Sure, absolutely. So, I think the goal for Dremio really is to empower business analysts and data scientists, we call these data consumers, to be more self-sufficient, and enables data engineers to be a lot more productive. And if you think about it, in our personal lives, we have this great experience with data, right? Even my kids, they go online, they ask Google a question, they get an answer, and life is great. But then all of us, when we come to work, and especially in larger companies, getting anything done with data is basically impossible, right? It's an engineering project every single time. And so you think about what ends up happening is, data lives in all these different places, and it has to be loaded into some kind of maybe a data lake, and can't be queried fast enough there. So it has to be, a subset of that has to be moved into various data warehouses and data marts, and those aren't fast enough. So then you end up building cubes and aggregation tables and all these different structures, BI extracts, and then finally the user maybe can do something with the data. But because of that complexity and all the copies of data, they really can't do anything on their own. And so they're dependent on a very small group of data engineers to do anything. That usually means that it takes weeks or months to actually answer a question. And of course, it's a very frustrating experience for the people that are responsible for the data within IT. So, yeah, as you think about what what Dremio does is it's a system that companies can deploy within their organization. About 60% of our customers run it either on Amazon or on Azure, and the other 40% run it on-prem. But really, it connects to your data sources, and typically there's kind of one primary data lake that it's connecting to or running on. And then potentially there are other sources like relational databases that also have some data. And Dremio basically exposes that data and makes it so that people can discover data and query it at speeds that they were just not able to do before.
And from looking at the product and tinkering with it a little bit, one of the things that really makes it stand out in my mind from a BI platform that can also connect to some of these various data sources is the ability to merge the outputs of some of those data sources or be able to join across them within a single query because of some of the reflection capabilities in the platform. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about some of the features of Dremio that are unique to it as a platform that you don't necessarily find in some of these other products, such as I mentioned, some of these BI platforms or things like Presto or some of these SQL engines that are able to connect to various data sources.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about ultimately what users are trying to accomplish, they have data in potentially one or more places, and they want to query that data, and they want to do it fast. But unfortunately, sometimes the reality is just that due to the size of the data or the speed of the data source, whether that's an S3 data source or it's a SQL Server database, there's only so much speed you can get by scanning the raw data to answer the query, right, and to process it. And we have an extremely fast engine. We actually pioneered a project called Apache Arrow to make that faster than it's ever been. But at the end of the day, to really get kind of orders of magnitude, maybe thousands of times better performance on large data sets, you really have to avoid scanning the entire data set as a query engine for every single query, right? It's very expensive and it's very slow if you do that. So if you think about kind of traditionally in databases, we had things like indexes and cubes and OLAP technologies and materialized views in some systems. So all of those types of technologies and are really about making it so that there are better data structures inside the system that enable the system to answer queries much faster, right, without having to scan all the records. And that's fundamentally what Dremio does with data reflections, is we can maintain various aggregations or various sorts or projections of the data behind the scenes in a way that's transparent to the user that's interacting with the data. And then the optimizer can automatically leverage those reflections to accelerate the queries. And the effect of that is that a query that might take you, let's say 5 or 10 minutes or more than that in a solution like Presto or Hive or something like that, with Dremio could run in less than a second. And that means that the user who's consuming the data, whether they're kind of a less technical user using something like a Tableau, Microsoft Power BI, or something like that, or maybe they're more technical using something like Jupyter Notebooks, they need an interactive response time, because if every click of the mouse or every kind of step in the notebook takes many minutes to run, it just becomes impossible to do, right? They're not going to wait to spend 4 hours building some visualization, right? It's just not realistic. And what ends up happening is they just give up. And so with Dremio, for the first time, you're able to make querying of large data sets of big data basically interactive.
And so the reflections are one of the ways that Dremio handles that interactive speed, as well as the fact that you're using Arrow for being able to manage the data sets in memory in an efficient format. But for the first time that somebody goes to run a specific aggregation against a data source, do they still have that initial latency of having to scan the source data and build the aggregation so that it can be cached in that reflection? And I'm also curious if you have any mechanisms in place for being able to keep those aggregates fresh as new data flows into the various sources.
So let's start with let's take a step back here for a second. When you think about how companies, organizations use Dremio, at the core we have an extremely fast distributed execution engine, right? So we've looked at, okay, what are the ways in which we can kind of take what has traditionally been pretty slow systems, like Hive, right, and make that extremely fast, irrespective of these reflections, right? So we actually started the Apache Arrow project in large part to make better use of CPUs, right? To be very efficient, to leverage kind of vectorized processing, which is now available on modern Intel CPUs and in the public clouds. And so that was the first thing. And Arrow has really taken off and become an industry standard. So over 1 million downloads a month now for Apache Arrow. And that's kind of the engine, right? If you think of Dremio being the car, Apache Arrow is the engine. It's what allows us to process kind of raw data extremely fast, right? If it's data in HDFS or data in S3 or ADLS. Beyond that, the reality is that sometimes there's just the physics are such that if you have 1 trillion records or hundreds of billions of records on your in your environment, it's just going to be too slow no matter how fast the engine is. And for those cases, it's all about creating these data structures, these reflections, right? And the way it happens typically in Dremio is that the users will, unlike say traditionally, you've had systems that are very IT driven, right? You'd have to go design and build cubes and spend weeks or months kind of trying to figure out what questions people are going to ask so you can build the right cubes. And by the time you build the cube, their questions were not the same anymore, and it was obviously a big problem in terms of agility, and people hated that. And so we take a different approach, which is much more like, it's almost like comparing Agile to kind of waterfall development models, right? So our users they'll start querying data. Usually it's extremely fast. And then if they need something to be even faster, then reflections can be defined kind of behind the scenes, though, in a way that's transparent to the user. So the user doesn't have to change their Tableau dashboard, for example. That stays the same. It's the responsibility of the Dremio optimizer to rewrite the query plan internally to leverage the reflection instead of the raw data. So that's kind of how it works. If you've just started using the system right now, there are no reflections in the system, and the speed will be what we can achieve using the Apache Arrow based execution engine, which should give you several factors of speed up over kind of a typical SQL engine like Hive, let's say.
And taking a step back to the product level itself, one of the factors that makes Dremio very approachable for businesses of all sizes is the fact that you have chosen to release it as open source. So I'm curious what your motivation was for that decision, and what sort of governance model you have in place to shepherd the open source aspects of the project.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we thought about kind of how we wanted to make Dremio available, it was pretty clear to us that the right approach was to kind of have that open core model, right? So you think a lot of data infrastructure is open source, and it makes it easier for companies to consume. And actually, many of our existing customers now, be it Microsoft or UBS, started by downloading the community edition of the product, and so that's really proven to be a very successful model for us. Dremio Community Edition, the code is actually in Dremio's GitHub, right? And people can come see that and use the code. But it's not an Apache project, right? So there isn't, it's more similar to Elasticsearch or to MongoDB than it is to, say, things like Hadoop, in that, we own the copyright and we're the primary developers of it. That said, we do receive contributions from other organizations. So we've, for example, with data sources, we've seen contributions of new connectors, like a KDB connector from UBS, or I just saw on GitHub, Software AG published a connector to one of their databases. So we're starting to see a lot of momentum around companies wanting to contribute various aspects of it. And that's, of course, in addition to the over 200 developers that now work outside of Dremio that now work on Apache Arrow, which is basically our engine.
And so we touched a little bit on some of the unique aspects of Dremio as it compares to things such as Presto or BI tools, but I'm wondering if you can dig a bit more into how you view the way that Dremio fits into the overall landscape of data tools.
Yeah, it's if you think about the situation that companies are in, right? There are a variety of tools out there and systems that you can adopt, right? There are query engines, and there's data prep tools, and there's data catalogs, and there are some cube type products. And at the end of the day, companies can try to kind of stitch all these things together and try to provide kind of some ability for data consumers to be able to access and utilize data. The reality is that to be successful, you end up having to hire basically a data engineer for every data analyst, for every business analyst that you have in the company. And that's just not realistic for 99% of the companies in the world. Right. And so if you think about what Dremio does, is we've actually created a new type of product, right? We call it, we think of it as a new category, and that's why we call it a data as a service platform. And you will see elements of other kind of categories in the solution here, but fundamentally it's something very different. And when people ask us, how does this compare to something else? Typically what you see there is that it's a little bit like comparing an iPhone to like an SLR, right? Of course, they compete in some way, because as a customer, I have to choose whether I'm going to take pictures of my kids with my camera or with my SLR. I have a nice kind of high-end Nikon SLR, or do I take pictures using my phone? And more often than not, these days, I'm using my phone, because I can easily send the picture on WhatsApp to my family, or post them on Facebook, and they get backed up automatically on Google Photos, and all this integrated experience that I get by using the phone as opposed to kind of that SLR. And in a way, that's kind of how Dremio fits, right? We, more often than not, if we're replacing something, we're really replacing kind of a complex process that involves creating lots of copies, pre-processing the data in like a data warehouse, building cubes, building aggregation tables, building BI extracts. That whole complex pipeline is what we focus on. So we're not replacing something like let's say Spark, where you're primarily using that for kind of the batch processing, but definitely in terms of we're definitely the platform and the layer that is enabling access to data and providing kind of the query execution.
And as you mentioned, there are a lot of different aspects to Dremio that cause it to overlap on a number of other products, but not necessarily with the same level of depth. But given the fact that it's all integrated, it makes the overall system easier to use. So I'm curious if you think that, at least for a particular scale of company, having Dremio installed would obviate the need for either a large-scale data warehouse or data lake that they would otherwise otherwise have to maintain to be able to get the same sort of functionality?
Yeah, when it comes to so for I think people can see the types of customers we work with on our website, primarily enterprises across various different verticals, ranging from tech companies like Microsoft to more retail focused companies, Royal Caribbean and so forth. And when it comes to the data lake, we don't replace the data lake, but I think what we do is we make it useful for the first time, right, to a broad set of users. So in most companies, I think there's been a lot of investment in the data lake, millions of dollars poured into these data lakes. And at the end of the day, I think the benefit has been limited to the technical people in the company, the engineers. Right. So if you're a Java engineer or a Scala engineer, you've probably gotten pretty good value from having the data kind of in that data lake. But if you're a Tableau user or even maybe a data scientist, so kind of that range of the more of the data consumer, I think it's been a struggle because you've probably tried to go in there and run a Hive query, and it was frustrating how slow it was. And as a result, companies try to kind of get the data out of the data lake and put it somewhere else so that you can get reasonable performance on your queries. And so Dremio comes in, we sit on the data lake, and we make it so that for the first time, you can actually get an ability to query data with interactive speed and to get a response time that actually works for kind of a BI user, right? Somebody who's not technical. And I think that's one of the key value propositions. When it comes to how do we replace the data warehouse, I think there are two use cases for data warehouses. One is as the kind of the historical store of store of record for data, for example, storing all my historical financials, right, for a company or HR data, and we don't replace that. So there's definitely people would still want to use the data warehouse for that. But when it comes to using kind of the data warehouse more as just like an MPP database, right, high performance queries for kind of ad hoc analytics and BI, we're definitely helping companies replace the data warehouse for those use cases.
And given the fact that there are so many different concerns built into the Dremio product, I imagine that can lead to some measure of complexity in terms of development and managing the overall growth and maintenance of the project. So I'm curious if there are any particular strategies that you have as a business and as a development team to be able to manage that integration of all of these different pieces into the whole. So things like the governance capabilities, data lineage, the built-in data catalog, et cetera.
Yeah, there's two parts to that answer. I think first of all, you're absolutely right that to build something that can do what this does and provide that kind of an integrated experience, that requires a lot of developing a significant amount of IP, right? It's everything from kind of query optimizer technology to query execution to having a great user experience, right? And that's typically not found within a single company. And so it comes down to kind of hiring top talent from an engineering standpoint, people that have expertise in these areas and have built kind of execution engines, have worked on the Oracle kernel, have built have been committers on various successful open source projects. So that's been kind of our focus when it comes to kind of building the engineering team is really hiring people that can build these types of things. And then also just from a product standpoint, this isn't about building basically multiple different unrelated technologies, right? We get the fact that it is part of one solution gives us a tremendous amount of benefit. So for example, if you think about Dremio, we the product includes basically a semantic layer, right? So people can, the users can create new virtual data sets, because often what happens in companies is the gold copy of the data is not exactly what the user wants, and today they have to go to IT and request kind of some project to get the data into their desired shape. With Dremio, they can actually create a new virtual data set either visually or by defining a SQL select statement, and that new virtual data set can then be queried from any external tool. But if you compare that to say a data prep tool is actually now having to execute kind of a batch process, a nightly batch process, and create another copy of the data. With Dremio, that doesn't happen. The virtual data set is basically a logical definition, which means that there's no cost to creating those things, and the kind of the data curation layer in Dremio builds on top of that, the semantic layer in Dremio. So we actually get all these benefits from having kind of an integrated platform, both from a development standpoint and a QA standpoint, and then of course the customer benefits from not having hundreds of data copies in the company, for example.
in a lot of cases, some of those different concerns are available in dedicated products for that specific use case. So, whether it be the data curation or the data governance, and in some ways, that makes it easier to integrate multiple systems with that particular concern. Whereas with Dremio, having it all being built into the same system, I'm curious if you have any external integration points for other tools to be able to take advantage of the data catalog or the data lineage that you store within Dremio itself, for then being able to leverage in other systems that are serving different concerns within the business.
Yeah, for sure. So our customers, they frequently use an enterprise data catalog or a data prep tool, but those serve kind of a different use case, right? So if we're focused on enabling access and data exploration and analysis on your data, either on the data lake or across multiple sources, a data catalog is focused on taking all the data in the enterprise across potentially thousands of databases and kind of exposing that in a collaborative interface. And to that tool, Dremio looks just like any other database. So we expose ODBC and JDBC as well as REST APIs. And if it's a data catalog, for example, just like the BI tools can connect to us, the data catalogs can connect to us and immediately see all the information in our system. In addition to that, everything that we have in Dremio is exposed through REST APIs, so it's very easy to integrate. But again, we're really focused. If you think about kind of the data lifecycle, we're really focused on that last mile, right? So the customers is still they're still going to use ETL tools. They're still going to use kind of Spark jobs for kind of their heavy duty, their batch processing, the things that have to happen every night to clean the data or land it or whatever. Dremio is really focused on that last mile. So you think about the data exists somewhere and it's largely been kind of organized in some way that seems reasonable to the company. But then, every user wants things to be a little bit different, right? And Dremio enables users to create their own virtual data sets that are derived from other data sets in the company and kind of provides that almost like a Google Drive or Google Docs type of an experience for data.
And in terms of the overall architecture of the system, you mentioned that Arrow serves as a primary component of the core execution engine, but I'm curious how the rest of the system is architected, particularly as far as integrating some of these various concerns that we were just discussing and being able to manage the ongoing development of them without introducing conflicts at the source level.
Sure. Yeah, so the architecture of Dremio is kind of at the bottom, we have the connectors to data, right? And so we obviously have very sophisticated connectors to things like HDFS, S3, ADLS that are highly parallelized, high performance, and support a variety of file formats like Parquet and ORC. When it comes to kind of more of the NoSQL and relational databases, we have connectors for those as well. And those are very focused on how do you push down processing, be it aggregations, filters, projections, window functions into the underlying data sources. So we have this connector architecture where that's very extensible and people can build new connectors and enhance the connectors. On top of that, you have kind of the execution layer, which is all about running distributed query execution, right? Utilizing Apache Arrow as kind of an in-memory columnar format and really kind of focusing on just raw performance there. The reflections kind of sit to the side of that where the engine can query and read the reflections if that's what the optimizer decides is the best path to kind of the lowest cost query. So that's kind of another piece of that. And then on top of all this, we have kind of the user interface. And the user interface is really about making things simple for non-technical users. So when you create a new virtual data set, which is kind of similar to a view, you can do that through SQL. You can say this is the view and it's joined between my Hadoop data or my S3 data and my Oracle database. But for a non-technical user, doing that is too hard, right? Writing that kind of a SQL join. So they can interact with the data kind of visually. You could look at your Hive table and say, click the join button, and the system will say, hey, what, we recommend you might want to join this with this other data set based on what other people are doing. So that's kind of the user interface. And when you interact with data sets, you can then save that as a virtual data set, which basically translates into just a SQL select statement that gets saved as metadata. And now that becomes another data set in the system that people can look at. And because we have all this, we really understand all these virtual data sets. They're SQL statements, and we have an optimizer and a SQL engine. We understand the relationship between all these data sets, so that gives us the ability to very easily do things like lineage and show you what exactly depends on what. And if you want to do data masking and row and column level permissions, that's also very easy to do because underneath the hood, there's a SQL statement that defines every data set.
And that last piece that you mentioned is one of the things in particular that I think adds a lot of value to Dremio is that granular access control and governance of the source data without having to push that concern down to the specific source engines, because I know that for some of the different business intelligence platforms, the permissions are actually managed at the database level, which can increase the overall complexity and the difficulty of being able to get a unified view of who has access to what. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about some of the ways that you manage those granular controls and some of the implementation of that.
So Dremio, well, we can definitely respect the underlying permissions of the data sources. But on top of that, we allow companies to really control who can access what data, right? And so if you think about Dremio as being that platform that's used by the consumer of data, by the end user to discover, to explore, to query data sets, regardless of what data source they're in, that means that Dremio can now basically be in a position where it can restrict access to specific data sets. And that can be as simple as, these data sets are accessible to this LDAP group and not this other group of users. And it could be more sophisticated. It could be, if you're a member of this group, you can only see the last 4 digits of this column or of the social security number column. But if you're a member of this other group, you can actually see that whole thing. And it's really the same data set that's being accessed. And so that just having this one platform that through which the people are accessing the data gives us that the ability to be that layer of control, right? Where if you were just sitting to the side, you could have data masking and all these things in your product. But anytime somebody went to the data through some other tool, a BI tool or a notebook, there would be no access control, right? And so that's kind of what Dremio brings to the table here. On top of that, I think the fact that you have kind of a system that enables self-service means that people don't have to now download the data into kind of these disconnected copies like spreadsheets and servers under their desks, which is where all the data governance problems start, right? If you don't give people access to data and don't empower them, they will find a way to do it themselves, and most likely they're going to be downloading data onto their laptops. And at that point, you've totally lost control as an organization, and you have no idea what people are doing with the data, where it's existing, what's being shared. And having a system like Dremio enables IT to then kind of empower the end users to have kind of this self-service experience, but at the same time to really understand what are people doing with data, who are they sharing it with, how often are various data sets being accessed, and are people doing things that they shouldn't be doing?
And for somebody who is interested in deploying Dremio into their own environment and putting it to use, what is involved in actually getting it set up, and what are the different scaling factors for being able to add capacity to the installation?
Yeah, so Dremio is typically deployed in one of two ways. For people running it on Azure or AWS, we provide kind of a Kubernetes option with Helm charts that makes it very easy to deploy the product. When it comes to people that are on-prem, kind of have Hadoop clusters, we just integrate with Yarn, which is kind of the scheduler on Hadoop that makes it really easy to kind of scale out Dremio on top of the data lake. The product comes the Dremio project is composed of kind of two different roles. One is the Dremio coordinator, and one is the Dremio executor. And the coordinator is basically kind of deployed on your edge node. That's what, say, the BI tools would be connecting to. And it's also the node that kind of serves the user interface. So you'd want to have maybe one or maybe several coordinators from an HA and kind of concurrency standpoint, and you can scale that out independently. So that's kind of one aspect is the coordinators. And then the executors are responsible for kind of query execution. And that's more driven by how much data do you have and what's the kind of the volume of data being processed by the queries. And that too can be scaled out independently. So you could scale it. You could have 10 executors and you can have 100 executors. And if you're running on something like with Yarn, it's as simple as saying how many executors you want, and we automatically take care of kind of provisioning and deprovisioning those.
So Dremio itself has been public for a relatively short period of time, but in that span, you have released a number of different iterations and releases of it. So I'm curious, what are some of the most exciting features that have been added recently, and some of the things that your customers are gaining the most benefit from?
We try to release a major release once every 6 months. So we launched the company and the product about a year ago, just over a year ago, and we did our 3.0 release last week. So if you look at the kind of the website in terms of what's new with 3.0, We introduced a number of new things. We introduced a kind of an integrated catalog experience where users can tag data sets and also kind of have this collaborative wiki to describe various data sets and the spaces in which data sets live. So that's kind of one example of something that was added. We also added kind of sophisticated workload management capabilities, which allow you to control what different users and groups are allowed to do and how much resources they get. So if you wanted to say something like, the interns are not allowed to use the system between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. the next morning, you could do that. Or maybe you just want to say that they can only get 10% of the resources at specific times. So you have all sorts of flexibility around workload management. So that's something we released in preview in the 3.0 release. We also announced a new initiative called Gandiva, which we integrated into Dremio and also contributed to Arrow. That basically leverages a compiler called LLVM to generate kind of vectorized code. So columnar, very kind of advanced columnar processing of data. And for queries that have kind of complex filters and projections, especially, so, big case statements and various UDFs, that can actually increase performance by, in some cases, we've seen 80x on some of the queries that our customers run. So that's been very important to our customers. We've also added various security related capabilities, whether it's kind of end-to-end encryption on the wire of all data using TLS, or it's using EC2 instance profiles to access data, and a variety of things like that. So, and then one other thing is we created a new framework for connectors in Dremio, which we called ARP, Advanced Relational Pushdown. And that basically sets us up to be able to deliver many new connectors over the coming months. So you'll see the number of connectors really, really expand as a result of that. And also the quality of the existing relational database connectors will really improve as well. So in terms of how much gets pushed down, and can all the window functions get pushed down, can all sorts of different aggregations, correlated subqueries. There's just a rich set of things that now all get pushed down into the underlying source, if the underlying source supports that, and if that's the best plan, right, compared to, say, using a reflection.
And it's easy when discussing all of the different capabilities and features of Dremio to start to think that it's the sort of cure-all for your data problems. But I'm curious, what are some of the situations where it's actually the wrong tool for the job, where something else would be a better fit?
Yeah, it's interesting. We, in fact, sometimes people see the demo and they're like, "Well, this is too good to be true," and because it really, for the first time, enables people that could not be productive with data to be productive, and makes it so that data engineers don't have to kind of do that very reactive, kind of tedious work that they hate doing, right? So I think that's all great. I think it like you're saying, it's important to really understand what the system is great at and what it's not. And I think the two kind of key things are to keep in mind, to make sure that you're aware of when you're adopting Dremio, is the first one being, it's not an ETL tool, right? So if your use case is, I want to run 5-hour jobs every night, then there are systems that are designed for batch processing. They do a lot of checkpointing as the queries are running. They're very slow though, but they'll get the job done, right? That 5-hour query. And I think so if you think of things like Spark and Hive, those are really good for batch processing. And that's what we'd recommend for those 5-hour jobs. And then the other thing I think that's important is also understanding that, this is a distributed system, and you want to make sure that you are giving it the resources that are required to be successful. So you can't, every so often somebody will come to us and they'll try to run Dremio on one server, and just the volume of data that they want, or they want to support thousands of users. And the system is designed to scale out, so you just got to make sure that you're kind of sizing it for whatever you're trying to accomplish.
And so with the scope and capabilities of the project, I'm sure that there are some aspects of it that have proven to be rather challenging. So I'm curious to hear what have been some of the most challenging aspects of building and maintaining and growing both the technical and business aspects of Dremio.
So we launched about a year ago, and the last year has been incredible for us, way beyond anything that we had imagined. Obviously you can see the types of companies that have already become customers, whether it's the largest banks in the world and the largest tech companies and largest alcohol manufacturers and cruise lines and so forth, right? So that's it's been kind of a great experience for us. That has required a lot of effort for the entire team here, and so As we've kind of scaled up the organization, and I think we've grown 3x as a company in the last year, addressing the needs of these types of companies and kind of addressing their feature requests and making sure that we're doing a great job supporting them 24/7. Those are obviously challenges that we as an organization have to deal with, right, and execute on. So I think that's something that we've been doing. We've opened up other sites internationally so that we can provide that kind of around the clock experience to our customers. Certainly the breadth of the product, if you think of just the kind of the capabilities and what's needed to deliver this kind of an experience that's, to the end user magical, it requires a lot of investment in kind of development, but an equal amount of investment in kind of QA and testing. And so we have tens of thousands of tests that run every day to really, if you think about all the different types of queries that people could run and all these different environments and data sources and BI tools and so forth, there's no way that can be done manually, right, by somebody sitting there and running a few queries and testing things out. So we have really incredible kind of test suites that we run regularly to help us make sure that the system is working as it should in all these different combinations. And it's not just working, but it's making sure that the performance did not degrade because somebody checked in some code that potentially introduces some problem. And it's making sure that memory consumption of the system hasn't changed from one release to another release in a negative way. So those are the kinds of investments we do to make sure that we can kind of deliver on this.
And as you look forward to the future of Dremio, what are some of the things that you have planned that you're most excited for?
What are some of the things that are planned? So we typically don't talk a lot about the future, but there's a huge amount of engineering going on right now in terms of new capabilities in the product, and those span kind of many different areas. One thing you can expect to see from us over the next year is dozens of new connectors to data sources, ranging from a variety of SQL kind of relational systems to SaaS applications and other sources. I think you can expect to see Dremio being increasingly easier and easier to consume for a company. So even if I do not have a data engineering team, I should still be able to take advantage of this. Or if I have a very small one, like a lot of companies, the data engineering team is really understaffed and they can't find the number of people that they need in order to be successful. You'll see us continue to make kind of engineering investments to make it possible for these small teams to kind of do the work of teams that are 10 times the size. So those are other things in terms of autonomous and kind of AI-driven capabilities inside of the product.
And are there any other aspects of Dremio and data self-service and just the data space in general that we didn't discuss yet, which you think we should cover before we close out the show?
It's always hard to answer what we didn't do because we would have done it otherwise. No, I think we've covered we've really covered a lot of ground here.
So for anybody who wants to follow along with the work that you're doing and get in touch, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I think we're solving the biggest gap, but but there's obviously a lot more to do. And as I look at really in the years to come, we as an industry have to make it easier, right? I think companies understand that they have to be data driven. I think that's not a question anymore, right? If you're a credit card company, the most valuable asset you have is not the credit cards, it's the data that you have about all these people that are buying things and what are they buying and how are they interacting with your systems. And that's the advantage that you have over, say, your competitors, right? And being able to tap into your data and use it for everything from security to marketing to kind of delivering a better experience, I think requires everybody in the company to be data driven. And there's a lot of work, I think, remaining to accomplish that, right? I think it's great in our personal lives. Like I said, my kids are in elementary school and they go online all the time and ask questions and get answers. And I think it's still too hard within companies to work with kind of business data and that's kind of what we're focused on. But obviously there's a lot more to do.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss the work that you're doing at Dremio. It's definitely a very interesting product and one that I've been keeping an eye on for a while now and something that I plan to take advantage of in my own systems shortly. So thank you again for that. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much.